If you'd like to go over here, that'd be great.
This bill, the Firearms Industry Non-Discrimination Act, was made necessary by a program that was started in 2011 called Operation Choke Point. What that involved was the singling out of industries, and including the firearms industry, for higher risk designation. In other words, if you were a dealer or a manufacturer of firearms, you were deemed to be a high risk customer. This was something that came down, it was a program that came down from Washington. It was denied at first, but then in 2014, an oversight committee in the U.S. House of Representatives brought to the surface memos that documented that this indeed had happened. And we had in the Senate committee testimony from business people in Georgia who had been the victims of this singling out for discrimination. The idea behind the program, Operation Choke Point, was to dry up the ability of businesses that support our Second Amendment freedoms from even operating, basically to run them out of business, because they were being denied checking accounts, payment processing accounts, and other financial services that any business needs to survive. Congress, at least the House, has passed a bill that is aimed at stopping this practice. Now, we've heard reports that the Obama administration has stopped the practice. But that is somewhat, there's a credibility gap because they denied there was ever a program in effect until they were basically caught red-handed. So the industry that supports our Second Amendment rights has come to our legislature requesting protection from denial of financial services solely because they are in the business of either selling or manufacturing firearms or ammunition. Now, in Georgia, that industry is important to our economy. Studies have been done that show that the direct and indirect economic impact is close to $1 billion annually. Nearly 6,000 employees are affected or involved in this industry. And these are the people that we're trying to shield from this insidious discrimination. Now, how widespread was it? Survey in the industry indicated that over 50% of the membership of the trade association that exists for the industry had experienced firsthand this treatment. So it is necessary. We cannot wait on action from Congress because even though the bill passed the House, The Obama administration has already indicated it would veto the bill. So it's up to us at the state level to provide some protection. Now, one of the changes we made in this bill in the Senate was to strip away from the original language of the bill a right of action, a private right of action, and to vest enforcement in the state's Attorney General office. We believe that will allay any concerns that this would spawn frivolous litigation. Now, I have others with me today who can help fill in some of the details, answer some of the questions. Have Mr. Raymond White and Trevor Santos, who represents the trade association. We had some of the business persons who had testified earlier available, but because of the change in time, were unable to be here this afternoon. But with that, I would like to offer the opportunity for these gentlemen to add to what I've already said.
Okay, we can go ahead and call up Trevor Santos.
Trevor Santos.
If you can please state who you're with, organization you're with as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Trevor Santos. I am the Manager of Government Relations for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. We're the trade association for America's firearms, ammunition, and hunting industry. We represent more than 13,000 manufacturers, distributors, retailers, shooting ranges, and sportsmen's organizations. So basically anything on the business side of the firearms and ammunition industry, we are their trade association. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to hear this bill today. It's of extreme importance to us and the members that we represent. I'd also like to thank Senator Stone for introducing this bill and carrying it through the Senate. The language for Senate Bill 282 would ensure that those involved in the firearms industry are not denied financial services solely because they're involved in the lawful commerce of firearms and ammunition products. Now, some say that this is a solution in search of a problem, but let me tell you why it's needed. As Senator Stone mentioned, the Obama administration initiative known as Operation Choke Point, that was by the DOJ in conjunction with FDIC. It was an effort to coerce banks, payment processors, and other financial institutions to choke off funds to those considered high risk or a reputational risk. Among the more than 25 industries that were included in Operation Choke Point, the firearms and ammunition industries were included without any evidence or justification to be deemed a high risk or a reputational risk. Unfortunately, the discrimination against those in our industries goes further, even beyond financial services. However, the bill before you today will just address our concerns with the financial services. This would go as far as banks and payment processors. We've seen issues with companies such as Square and PayPal refusing to do business with those in our industry solely because they sell firearms or they make firearms. I'd also like to note that there have been some claims that Operation Choke Point is over. The administration has says that they are no longer working on this initiative. However, I received a call just 2 days ago from a member of ours that stated that they would not be given the financial support they needed from a bank that they've done business with for a long time because they have now been deemed high risk. I'd also like to mention that we've done some work with some other groups on this bill. We've done our best to work with the credit unions to address some of their issues regarding their field of membership, and hopefully we can get to a point where they feel comfortable and they get the language that they need. But I'd like to touch on the firearms industry in Georgia and the positive economic impact it has here in the state. It directly supports more than 3,300 jobs, but it's more than 7,000 total. Those are both direct and indirect jobs. It's paying over $104 million in wages. And according to a report conducted by the National Shooting Sports Foundation, we found that the total economic activity in the state of Georgia in the year of 2015 was more than $1.13 billion. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again for your consideration in hearing this bill today. And at this point, I will stand to answer any questions that you may have.
We have questions for Mr. Santos and also for the senator as well. Who's desk 46? Okay. What number are you, Tom? Pick up your mic and he's going to be 16.
That's me.
There you go.
Okay.
Chairman Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to make sure I understand that what we're doing is, what you're asking us to do is to have a law in the state of Georgia that says you can't discriminate against firearm dealers or manufacturers, even though there has been, I'm assuming that this has been just a regulatory issue through the FDIC or some other banking regulatory agency that placed gun dealers or manufacturers in a higher risk category with respect to insurance or the regulatory scheme that they impose on banks and or credit unions.
To answer your question, yes, that is exactly what we're trying to do. But just because this was an effort under this administration doesn't mean that the discrimination that our members are experiencing is going to cease to exist, because we know firsthand that it's still happening and retailers are still experiencing this kind of discrimination.
Well, wouldn't you agree that the state of Georgia and the General Assembly has no control over federal insurance agencies or federal agencies in general?
Yes, to answer your question,
So
yes.
you're asking us to do something that will have no impact on the problem that you perceive at this point?
No, sir. I would have to disagree there, because Georgia does have power over banks with state deposits. And in this bill, we specifically mention any banks that accept state deposits.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with preemption? And what that means is the federal law preempts something that's directly on point with state law. What that means is federal law is going to apply and state law is not going to apply.
Yes, sir.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
And you agree with that?
I agree with that, but there's not been a law at the federal level. As far as Operation Choke Point goes, it was not a federal law.
And, well, let me ask you this. Would you also further agree that a federal regulation directly on point would preempt state law or state regulation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
To answer your question, I'm not aware of any federal regulation that is in effect on this point. So,
Well, did I misunderstand? Choke point is exactly that. It's where they're having them reclassify these gun manufacturing gun dealers to a higher risk and therefore adversely impact their ability to access capital.
it's policy, not a regulation.
Please step up to the mic.
To the best of our knowledge, there's been no regulation passed. It's just been an administrative enforcement policy.
Well, now, so what you're asking us to do is to force our banks to make a decision on whether they're going to follow federal policy or follow state law.
The policy itself doesn't have statutory or regulatory basis. So we don't think we're forcing our banks into a choice that they couldn't legally make. we're actually giving them a reason not to follow the strong suggestions of the FDIC or whoever is promoting Operation Choke Point. The nature of the program itself, it has dubious legality.
Well, if I could, Mr. Chairman, pose this question. That dubious legality would be something that need to be challenged in the courts by either the banks or the businesses that felt like they were discriminated against. Isn't that correct?
That would be the ultimate way to resolve the issue, but this will add strength to the effort to overturn these illegal actions.
Wait. The illegal action, I don't understand what an illegal action is if this is a policy of the federal government and we're preempted as a state government. I mean, do you say that, is there illegality? Is there a violation of the Constitution? Is there a violation of federal code or regulation?
It is extra, it is going beyond authority given in federal law, statute, or regulatory, in our opinion.
So this is a states' right versus federal rights, federalism type issue.
It's an area where we have power to provide some protection against that within our state.
Thank you, that helps.
And let's do this. Let's direct our questions right now to the author of the bill. Mr. Santos, if you want to take a seat, let's direct our questions to Chairman Stone at the moment. Move on to Chairman Houston. You should be on now.
Thank you, and thank you so much for bringing this bill. I went through a lot of headache with this, and I have a gun manufacturing company in my town that they tried to close. And it's mighty scary when the FDIC puts pressure on banks not to do business with people, and they have to go to Texas and find a bank to do business with them. And you don't have but 6 employees, and they're trying to close up something with 6 employees. But thankfully, through my senator and through the help of the Georgia Department of Economic Development, we got our problem worked out. Not with the banks, but with shipping. We were shipping some firearms to South Korea, where we have troops, and it was to go send it to South Korea, and they stopped it, and then tried to stop it through the banks. And when they tell a bank, if you bother with these gun manufacturers, you might get written up and everything, it scares the banks. There's so many regulations, and FDIC has such a problem. But when you try to close up a little bitty tiny gun manufacturing company, and I'm not one of these carry the gun people. I mean, I might pack something, but I'm not one of these real gunners. But that is scary, and I appreciate you bringing this to the forefront. And I thought somebody told me that they had a law had stopped this problem, but apparently the federal government has not passed a law making it illegal to discriminate.
That's true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Chairman Stone. Sounds like the origin of the problem is the Justice Department in D.C., and it sounds like the federal regulators. Could you rehash the posture of Congress? Because it sounds like the ultimate fix for this problem is Congress. I think you had mentioned it passed the House. I couldn't see why it wouldn't pass the Senate. And then obviously it sounds like there might be some sort of presidential veto.
Yeah, I might ask for my witnesses here if they have an update on where it might stand in the other chamber, but it's dead on arrival at the president's desk. That's what's been made public.
Thank you.
Representative Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, on line 21, help me understand why we include, and again, I'm a strong Second Amendment guy, and I want to protect all of our businesses in Georgia, but I've just got some questions about how we're going to attempt to do this and not make any mistakes. Line 21 says that accepts state deposits for any federally chartered banking institution. Why are we limited to federally chartered banks?
We would not have any basis for regulating federal banks that don't accept state deposits.
Well, why did you include them on line 19 under code section 714?
I'm not sure. Let me refer to that.
If I'm pulling this correctly, then we're looking at the definitions in that code section. Bank means corporation existing under the laws of this state, blah, blah, blah. Banks shall also include national banks located in this state for the purpose of Part 6 of Article 2 of this chapter relating to deposits, safe deposit agreements, and money received transmission, and Article 8 of this chapter relating to multiple deposit accounts. So that code section 714 clearly includes national banks in my layman's interpretation of that code section. So that's what threw me. Why just the ones you appear to be including national banks, but then subsecting, but then just with the sub limit of just federally charged banks that accept state deposits?
The purpose would be to reach all banks, but if there is a preemption issue, then the last portion that you were reading about accepting state deposits would be an argument against preemption.
Or they would fail to be able to be eligible to be a state depository institution.
Right.
That would automatically preclude them from doing that. If
It would automatically,
preclude them from being a state depository institution if they chose to, for whatever financial reason, decided not to buy the gun.
it would submit them to this bill if they are accepting state deposits, regardless of their charter status.
Then I'm going to go back to the fact that it seems to me it doesn't, if Code Section 714 already picks up national banks, I don't understand what being a state depository institution has to do with the matter.
I think this is something that would be an additional basis for reaching those institutions and would come into play where preemption is argued.
Thank you.
Chairman Nix, do you have a question?
Thank you. Senator, while I understand where you're coming from on this, I have a little bit of a problem in that part of the reason we had the recent banking crisis we had was because government started telling banks how they had to do business and who they could and couldn't lend to. And if you denied credit to potential homeowners, then you got into trouble. So I have a little bit of a pause, having been a banker. I've seen that where it was a lot more paperwork to turn down a loan than it was to make it. So I'm a little concerned that we're going down that road. This is not nearly as big as a mortgage loan crisis, but I'm a little concerned that the government would get this involved. Now, on the other side of the coin, I can't get my head around exactly what we're trying to fight. Is there a document in some place that the government has that lays this out? You will not loan to these people because?
During the Oversight Committee investigation, documents were obtained that listed firearm industry dealers and ammunition dealers and manufacturers as per se high risk for having deposit accounts or for conducting payment processing.
Okay, follow up, please. If we were to do this, how would a bank show that they had made a credit decision rather than a discriminatory decision against a business?
Banks would simply show that they followed their normal process of evaluating credit worthiness to open a checking account or whatever services is involved. It's to show discrimination on this, it has to be solely because they're a firearms industry member. That's a very hard thing for the person, or in this case, the Attorney General, who would screen through any frivolous cases. That would be a hard standard to show. But if you have a credit-worthy customer, someone who has good credit scores, has not had bad checks in the past, there's no other reason for them to be denied having a checking account or related service, then you might have a case, and it'd be in the Attorney General's good judgment to decide whether they warranted some state action to protect them from that discrimination.
Okay.
And there, as you pointed out, the banking industry is familiar with how to comply with anti-discrimination provisions. They're already in federal law, and so this does not add a burden because it's very narrowly drawn scope.
Okay. One last question. You started off with somewhat of an example of someone who was discriminated against. Can you tell us, who did that, and give us the details of how that discrimination took place? Was it a specific bank that refused them service, or what was the example and who did it?
The testimony, I don't remember the names of all the banks, or any of them for that matter, but the testimony was that one of the businessmen had been to 26 banks before, and every one of them refused to allow him to open a checking account. And some of them were upfront in telling him verbally that it was because of what type of business he was in.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator Stone, always a pleasure to see you.
Glad to be here.
I have a couple of questions for you. In light of the discussion, especially about the banks and the credit unions and the non-discriminatory and regulatory process, what countermeasures, if there are any countermeasures, are in place to allow community banks and/or credit unions to opt out of providing loans to suspected pipeline dealers and other gun runners who profit off their communities? Are there any opt-out provisions in place now that would basically mitigate or ameliorate that?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Representative Smith.
Banks and/or credit unions, are there any opt-out provisions for them to legally say this is why they refuse or would prefer not to do business with an entity such as this?
Not that I'm aware. Not that I'm aware of.
There are no opt-out provisions. Okay.
If I understand your question.
Okay. Secondary to that, as you know, the Georgia Chamber supports the businesses in the state of Georgia. Are you aware that the Georgia Chamber is against this legislation?
I'm not aware of their position on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Knight, did you have a question?
Thank you. The first question, Senator Stone, is you talked about the example and testimony. When did that happen? Is it recently,
I believe it was in 2014. The example of the witness that came.
I'm sorry. So yeah, but the example, in other words, they've been denied, there's denials recently is what you're telling me?
Yes, this is recent.
Of Georgia?
Yeah. In Georgia.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say I think more so this legislature probably than a lot of folks do understand the importance of gun manufacturers, the ammunition of what it does. Certainly as a hunter and sportsman, I know it contributes to our economy. So this is a very serious issue. But I guess I also want to make sure that we're not setting up two things. and I'll share the concerns. One of the concerns has already been mentioned here, but one is if this bill does pass, okay, and then it is preempted by federal law, what are we putting the state charter banks in jeopardy or at a disadvantage versus the federal banks? I mean, this is a true
I think
policy
if
question
it's
that
preempted, it's preempted. In other words, it wouldn't be enforceable if preemption kicks in.
Okay. And then, again, my second concern, because I know we've all heard from our local community banks, is if they're in a situation where they're dealing with a bad business decision versus a bad gun, supposedly, gun dealer, okay, is that going to put them in jeopardy of being between a rock and a hard spot? And I think that's the biggest concern that I know I've had, and that's where I want to make sure that we look at this and we're not, on one hand, fixing something, but on the other hand, putting our local community banks, state banks, at risk of being set up for lawsuit. And I think that's a legitimate concern, because
Right.
this is let me tell you, this is a
Yeah.
Second Amendment, General Assembly, state, and everything, but I want to make sure we're not fixing something and breaking another thing.
A bank, if it is pressured without citing statutes or regulations, if they're just told or strongly suggested not to provide services to this type of business, this statute, if enacted, this bill, would give them a reason not to yield to that suggestion. If it's a law, if it's a federal law, if there's a statute on federal level or regulation, then there is going to be preemption. And that will be taken into account by the Attorney General in how far to go in enforcing this statute. If the Attorney General, in his wisdom, sees that there is preemption here, then the Attorney General is not going to force banks into the situation of having to either choose between violating state law or violating federal law. I mean, if there's preemption, there's preemption. But we don't think there's preemption because there's not a statute and there's not a regulation. It's what is arguably an illegal policy with no lawful basis.
Okay. And I appreciate that on the preemption, but getting back to, I think, the question, and it's probably the question that's going around the room, I'm not speaking for anyone, but how do you put something in that protects the gun dealers from being discriminatory or discriminated against, but yet provides a clear path or it makes it clear that when a bank is making a business decision based on credit and all of the sound financial decisions that they make in evaluating whether they're going to make a loan or whatever with any business, how do we make that very clear in this such that we don't get the banks caught between a rock and a hard spot?
I think the fact that it's so narrowly drawn that it has to be discrimination solely on that basis of the status of the industry that the customer's in, that leaves the banks wide latitude to use whatever business judgment they want to deny or not deny services to a potential customer. It's just that one area that can't be the sole basis. for denial of services.
And I just read the bill, or part of the bill on 36, it said for any person to refuse to provide financial services of any kind. So it seems like it's just wide open.
Well, it's limited to financial services, but you're right. There are a number of types of financial services that would be covered.
We have several others that want to speak to this bill as well. A lot of questions still out there, so let's try to go as quickly as we can. Remember, this is just a hearing today. Representative Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Mr. Stone. I've got a lot of questions, but I'll limit mine just to a couple today. As I read through the bill, it gives certainly to me the impression that gun dealers are now being elevated to a protected class. They're a unique entity that's given some special protections, and very much like we have in housing, there are protections against discrimination for housing based on a variety of factors. There's discrimination in jobs based on gender and such. Those are generally conveyed to individuals, not to businesses or to corporations. Are you aware of any other scenario that is comparable to this, where an industry is given a protected class status?
I am not familiar enough with the broad scope of anti-discrimination laws to be competent to answer that question. However, I will say that this is a unique industry because it underlies the practical availability of firearms under the Second Amendment. In other words, we know that there are efforts to dry up the access to firearms. This is one of them. And this is a right enshrined in the Second Amendment. And we need to protect it from encroachment. And this distinguishes this sector from any other sector because it is critical to the enjoyment of our Second Amendment liberties.
Are you suggesting that there is a reduction in the number of firearms being purchased? Because everything I've read says that there are more firearms being purchased of late than ever before. So
if nothing is done to counter efforts like this, then yes, the availability of firearms will be restricted.
But that has not happened yet.
Well, that's hard to say. We don't know how many people have been chilled from entering into this industry because of the hurdles that this policy has put. It has a chilling effect on any person interested in entering into this type of business that supports our Second Amendment rights.
One last question, Senator. Would you be willing to accept an amendment that would provide similar protections to people based on gender or religion or national origin or sexual orientation or gender identity?
I think that would be outside the scope of this legislation. And it would be outside of the problem that this legislation is addressing.
Thank you.
Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Stone, in my years of being here in the General Assembly, normally when legislation is brought, it's either for a consistent reason by the public or a need or based upon something that we need to do to make life better for Georgians here. And as I read through this bill reads to me as a strong arm bill, as if we are allowing the gun manufacturers to force our financial institutions to give them loans. I am also looking at the repercussions of their decisions, if it's not agreeable to the gun owners based upon discriminatory practices or their view of it, which then they will take to the Attorney General. And I see the fines and penalties that are outlined here, but I don't see anything in here to protect our financial institutions in the event that they did not do any of these practices that they were accused of, as reversing this $10,000 and making that gun owner pay the banks. I don't see anything here to protect the banks. It's all about the gun manufacturers. So my question to you is, where are we with protecting our financial institutions here in the state of Georgia, who we value because this is part of our economic business here in the state? And where is it in here that the credit unions and the banks and financial institutions have a say in whether they will decide to give each individual here that applies for a loan the right of protection?
Well, if I understand your question, you're concerned about the reliefs that are granted in the event a violation occurs and is proven. I think the protection for the lenders, and to some extent this provides protection because it provides protection against pressure on banks.
But Senator, can you show me where that is?
No, that is how it operates, because it provides a basis for standing up to pressure from outside to deny services to people just because they are engaged in selling or manufacturing firearms or ammunition. The protection in the bill as amended is that this is not something that individuals can bring an action. We're not trying to encourage litigation. We're trying to stop a bad policy in Georgia, and that's why it's vested, enforcement is invested in the Attorney General. The only way an action can be brought is through the Attorney General.
A follow-up question?
All right, one last
My
one.
last one. Can you cite me some practices of some possible in the past gun owners or businesses that have incurred this type of discriminatory practice?
Well, there were 2 witnesses that came to the Senate committee. They also have submitted or had written statements. Be happy to provide you with those.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, thank you for being here to answer these questions. I'm still having a problem understanding how will banks and credit unions be protected. This question might have been asked earlier, and they deny a loan, but they're denied a particular loan because it was a bad loan, not based on the fact that
This would not have any bearing on their right to deny a loan because it's a bad loan.
So are they being protected? So is there any protection in this bill?
But the protection is the narrow right that's conferred under this bill. It does not give a bad borrower, that is someone with who would be a bad risk from suing because they didn't get a loan. There's nothing in this that gives a borrower that right. So banks have unfettered discretion to deny loans or to deny financial services for any business, but they can't, under this bill, if the only reason is because that business is in the firearms industry.
Thank you.
All right, two more. We'll make it kind of quick if we can. Representative Williamson.
Just a quick follow-up, Senator. So you mentioned earlier in your remarks, you said it would not be enforceable if preemption kicks in. I'm assuming we're talking about federal
Preemption, that's right.
Okay, so
I acknowledge that federal law preempts state law. So
in that, I'm just keep coming back to our community banks and credit unions.
Right.
And I personally, having a background in community banking, I love it when big banks act stupid. It just drives more business to us. In this case, you're saying that regulators might act stupid, and if in fact regulations come down from, for example, the OCC to the federal banks, and they're preempted, are you saying we'll automatically be preempted as well?
I would have no argument against that.
Are you going to, because the bill doesn't, the language of the bill doesn't give us that protection.
Well,
but
preemption.
Would that have to be interpreted every time by the Attorney General's office?
Preemption is something that is constitutional. The Constitution says that federal laws are supreme. So, you know, that is, if there's a law on point, okay, if there was a law that said you can't make a loan to a firearms manufacturer, even though that law might be illegal or challengeable, it would, at least on its surface, preempt. But there is no federal law.
Follow up, just real quick follow up on that point.
Real
Then
quick.
let me change my terminology then, because again, I apologize, I'm not an attorney. But what about, let's use the word parity, if the regulators have a regulation on the big banks that might put the community banking folks, the state chartered banks and credit unions at what could be a perceived disadvantage, would parity kick in if the Department of Banking and Finance said, hey, what's good for the national banks is going to be good for the state chartered banks because of an uneven playing field? Would it be okay to have parity language in the bill?
We wouldn't want to put our local banks, our Georgia banks,
Thank you.
at a disadvantage.
Chairman Nix.
Yeah, one more question. In some of the people we've left out as bankers, when you had your hearings in the Senate, did you have any bankers come in and say, look, we hate this thing because we want to do business with those folks? Did you have testimony from
We
bankers?
did, and I think there's some here.
And they said that they were having pressure put on them specifically as you're talking about.
They did acknowledge, if I recall correctly, that this
That
had
they
been,
need this
they were aware of this.
And they need this protection.
They didn't ask for the protection.
Chairman Morris.
Thank you, Mal.
You're on. If you'll speak up just
Gosh, this is bad. It's worse. It sounds worse. I just wanted to caution the members of the committee, and thank you for your questions, that any amendment that would attempt to add a protected class that's not in the subject matter of this bill would be out of order and would not be recognized of the such that was mentioned earlier. Other citizens that may, hope to amend this bill to be an added class that would be protected would not be recognized and would be deemed out of order.
I agree.
Okay, we have, thank you, Mr. Senator. We have 4 folks that have signed up. Chairwoman Howson, just for you, I'll let one more.
One quick question. I do feel sorry
It's on.
I do feel sorry for our local banks because I know it's hard for them to tell these gun manufacturers and dealers that they can't loan them money. But someone was saying that they had taken this, I can't remember the regulation, they called it the federal regulation, what's the choke point?
It's not, that's a program, that is
program,
a
choke point program that-
surreptitious program.
Okay, and that it was no longer in effect. Have the local banks, do you know if they've been told that this is not in effect? Because I just text a bank and they said they still could not make loans to gun.
How do you rescind a regulation that was never a
So I
regulation?
wondered if it was, they let them know it was not in effect
Yeah,
anymore.
I think the lending, I mean, the financial industry is confused. And we need to provide clarity.
All right, thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
We have 4 people that have signed up to speak on the bill as well. I'm going to ask if you can limit your testimony to 3 minutes, if possible. We'll start with Joe Brandon with the Georgia Bankers Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Joe Brandon. I'm the president of the Georgia Bankers Association. Our association is fortunate to have virtually every bank doing business in the state of Georgia as a member, from all over the state, all sizes, from the largest to the smallest, both state and nationally chartered banks. We were formed 124 years ago. This is my 36th legislative session representing this industry before you. Senator Stone, as he said, brought this in reaction to Operation Choke Point. That not only upset the firearms and ammunition industries, but it spawned a great deal of consternation among the banks, and you have heard some of that today. Our bankers are in the business of serving customers. They take deposits, they extend credit, all with plenty of regulatory oversight, both state and federal. Operation Choke Point was an unwelcome addition because it chose to pick winners and losers among our bank's customers. Our bankers were most concerned when we saw the list, the infamous list of 30 industries out there, that the firearms industry was on a list of high-risk industries alongside some truly unsavory businesses. We haven't heard any recent reports of any pressure on the banks to not serve the firearms or ammunition products industry. Frankly, we have Congress and especially the House Financial Services Committee to thank for that. They held hearings on Operation Choke Point. They called the federal regulators to testify to come justify their positions. They clearly could not. Georgia's 2 members on the House Financial Services Committee, Lynn Westmoreland and David Scott, led the charge, and we are forever in their debt to do that. They said, we will stop it, and stop it they have. January 2015, more than a year ago, FDIC backed down. They issued guidance. They took off the guidance that they had on their website. They reissued it and specifically said, we are not in the business of getting between you and your account holders. Those associated with, and that was good news for us because we had worked very, very hard at the federal level, actually arm in arm with our friends in the firearms industry to get to that point. It's good news because that has now happened. We've had the pleasure of serving the firearms industry for a long time. In fact, let me just give you one example. We've got two bankers serve in statewide position. They're under the microscope by everybody you can imagine. My chairman is a banker up in northeast Georgia in Elberton. He just made a multi-million-dollar loan just this month to an ammunition dealer. My chairman-elect, somebody else also under the microscope up in Cartersville, Georgia, has 2 firearms dealers as customers. Neither have had any pressure from FDIC or the state regulators to not do business with these customers. Just examples on our end. But that doesn't mean because Operation Choke Point is gone that we can avoid complying with federal rules relating to money laundering activities, mostly associated with potential illegal drug activities, gambling, and terrorist activities. That's where a lot of this is coming from, the anti-money laundering activities. I mentioned the microscope. The banks are under that microscope every day. Compliance with these rules have forced the banks to make sure they're sending in all the required paperwork, all the reports that they're generated from cash-heavy businesses, which those industries are a part of. But we're not in the business of deciding whether or not somebody's operating legally or not. That's not what we are in the business of doing. Our job is to provide those reports to law enforcement, work with law enforcement, and let them sort through all that. So with regard to this specific legislation, yes, we're opposed to it. One fellow said it's a bug looking for a windshield. It's just an issue that has been dealt with, in our view, at the federal level. We've heard a lot about preemption. Let me talk about that, because it is something that I have personally dealt with for the 36 years I've been doing this. The Federal National Bank Act is the federal legislation that covers national banking charters. And it deals with account relationships, either loan or deposit relationships. In my 36 years, I've seen twice that this General Assembly has attempted to do what you're doing today, to apply a piece of state legislation to national banks. Both times, the federal regulators and the courts preempted it. Both times. So to say that you have to have a specific law on the books dealing with firearms, you don't. All it has to have is language related to the account relationship, and that's what's in this bill. So if you choose to move forward with it, we heard about preemption language. We strongly suggest you include specific preemption language to protect our state-chartered banks in this legislation. The second reason, as you've already talked about, is that it creates special protections for the firearms and ammunition businesses that is not enjoyed by anybody else. We're in the business of managing risk. That's what we do. Most of the risk we manage is whether or not you're going to pay back the loan we made you. We have compliance risk too, and compliance risk is equally important in some cases because of severe penalties, civil money penalties on the banks if they get it wrong. We have to be able to look at a particular customer, look at the whole spectrum of risk, and decide if the safety and soundness argument is there. This bill challenges that basic principle. And finally, we oppose the bill because it radically changes the Fair Business Practices Act. That's not something you've talked about. That's what bill is being amended here. You're changing that bill from a consumer protection bill to one that now protects a class of business. There may be merit to consider that in the future, but I strongly encourage you to look very carefully at what you're doing here with that power. You're giving the Attorney General the power to investigate that. You've got language in there mandating that he investigate any letter that he gets, mandating that. Elsewhere in the Fair Business Practices Act, he's authorized to do that. I would encourage you to be very, very careful as you look at that, and don't go down the road of mandating something of the Attorney General that is not done for consumers. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that's it for us. I think I probably spoke 3.2 minutes, but we respectfully submit that Operation Choke Point has in fact been stopped, and this bill is not needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brannon. Next, we have Stephen Rigdon with the Community Bankers Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, I appreciate the time. I'll make my brief comments. Stephen Rigdon with the Community Bankers Association. I appreciate the comments from the committee. And Joe had mentioned a lot of the information that I was going to cover as well about Operation Choke Point and it being basically terminated as of January of 2015. I think the gentleman that testified that day in the Senate banking was referring to something that did happen in 2014. I do not know if those are still going on or not. We have done a survey of all of our community banks, being about 174 in the state of Georgia. Haven't heard of any instances where this is actually happening. And I know you said that you had texted a banker and that there may be still some of this going on. We're not aware of it. I was a community banker in a small town of Metter, Georgia for 17 years. And as a lender in a small town and a small community, you try to wait on every customer and help every customer that walks in your door. But there are going to be circumstances that will not allow me to help that customer. It may be a credit issue. It may be a collateral issue. It may be an income issue. It may be something that's outside of our level of expertise in my particular bank. I may have a concentration in that particular industry. I know a lot of banks do hotel motel loans, and they may reach to a point where they get to a concentration, so they're limited as to doing any additional business. The community bankers basically just oppose this bill and this legislation. We do believe that it creates a slippery slope. by basically demanding that banks service particular types of businesses by force of law. And we just think that this sets a bad precedence in giving a protected class status, basically, to the firearms industry. And again, I just want to say thank you to the committee, and if I can answer any questions, I'll be available. Thank you.
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Rigdon. Next, we have Brandy Bickle with the Georgia Credit Unions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and thank you for the members of the committee. We appreciate all of your time and your listening to our concerns with this bill. I will be brief because I realize time is short. We as the credit union industry, we are sympathetic to the concerns of the firearms industry. We lobbied on behalf of the bill that passed the House in Congress to make sure that Operation Choke Point never happens again. From our perspective, though, we have very strong concerns with the bill. And this is not new to, I think, anybody in the room, including the senator who's been very open in talking with us as well. So thank you, sir. Creating a state law to have special protections for this particular industry to address a concern with federal regulators in the Department of Justice would have detrimental impacts on our credit unions. You've heard it referenced about being disproportionate. If it does get preempted, then it's just left impacting our state chartered financial institutions. It would create a precedence for other industries. There were a lot of other industries on that choke point list that I'm sure would like to have the same types of protections. But unique for credit unions are a little different. You can't walk into every credit union and get a loan. You can't do that. We operate under field of membership rules. So those of you who aren't familiar with credit unions, you draw a circle when you have a credit union and you say, okay, these are the people that we're going to serve, whether that's a teacher's credit union, a hospital, whether it's a couple of counties. In the Senate Banking Committee, the testimony that was involved, and I think you heard a little references about it, they referenced, I want to say like 26 or 27 banks. They did name credit unions, 3 very specific credit unions on that list. I went back and spoke to those credit unions, and they weren't under any pressure by our credit union regulator to not serve firearms industry. But I submit to you the fact that the firearms industry perceived it as discrimination, it would open us up to some major issues, because then if you're perceived as discriminating, even though you aren't eligible to be a customer of that credit union, if you will, you still are subject to this bill. You're still being investigated by the Attorney General. You still have to prove that you weren't discriminating. And that gives us a lot of pause as an industry. If you do move ahead with this legislation, we beg of you to please consider the amendment that we've, I think, spoken to almost every one of you about, that would specifically recognize that, you know, if you are being told by your regulator you got to cool it with lending, and that applies to banks or credit unions, or if you are a membership organization, which credit unions are a membership organization, then it's not discrimination. You are just operating in the normal course of business. Like I said, from a credit union perspective, we do have a lot of concerns. It creates a lot of unintended consequences because we are a little different, and I think it leaves our industry open to a lot more investigations by the Attorney General for no reason whatsoever other than the fact that we are operating through our normal course of business, or we're adhering to what our regulators, our state and federal regulators, have asked us to do. So with that, I pause for any questions, but I try to be as brief as possible, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Bickle. No questions. And last but not least, maybe, Kyle Jackson with the Georgia Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. You've got a letter in your packets expressing many of the concerns you've previously heard. I'm not going to belabor the point, but there are serious preemption questions. It creates a new protected class here in Georgia, grants broad new powers to the Attorney General. I'm not sure he's asked for or wants. And to my knowledge, and I don't, others may be able to speak to this, I'm not sure any state has actually gone down this road yet. We think we ought to proceed carefully and cautiously with this because it could have some serious unintended consequences. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You have no questions. That's all who signed up to speak. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.